Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, as always, and today I'm joined for a second time by Dr. David Bjorklund. He's professor of psychology at Florida Atlantic University, and today we're going to talk about his new book, How Children Invented Humanity, the Role of Development in Human Evolution. So, Dr. Bjorklund, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I greatly appreciate it.
Okay, great. So, I think that I've already somewhat asked you this question last time, but since we're going to talk about the sort of interaction between development and evolution, where does development fit into, or how does development fit into the larger picture of evolution?
Well, very well, I think. Counter to the way many biologists, or perhaps most biologists, view development for much of the 20th century. Um, in the early days of evolutionary theory, early Darwinism, even pre-Darwinism, development played a very important role. Embryology played a very important role. But with the new synthesis, the modern synthesis, integrating Darwinian theory with Mendelian theory, the role of development seemed irrelevant. Development was an epiphenomena because what happened during the lifetime of the individual could not affect the germ cells and thus couldn't affect evolution. But with the, I guess, rediscovery of, in the terms of Evo-Devo, evolutionary developmental biology, development suddenly became very important again. It is changes in development of members of a species that provide the raw material for natural selection. And this Evo-Devo has really given a new dimension to evolutionary theory. And I think most people who have kept up with things recognize this now. I don't think development is no longer an outsider. And I think this is true for psychological development as well as physical development. The species has changed because plasticity, flexibility in the behavior and cognition and neurology of our species and other species as well provides the raw material for natural selection to work.
Mhm. So I asked you the question in a particular way. I asked you how does development fit into the larger picture of evolution, but is evolution really the larger picture? Is that the correct way of thinking about it?
Well, it all depends on what question you want to answer, of course. Um, and I think if you're interested, of course, in how the species became the way it is, how we became human, evolution is the right question, and development is part of the right answer, only part of it. If you want to look at how we become the adults we become, then development certainly plays a very important role. But we also have to keep in mind evolution is not irrelevant by any means because adults are adapted to our environments as well, or were adapted to our ancient environments. And we have to we don't want to forget the adult. I've been spending a lot of time over the years emphasizing the important role of development, and don't forget infants and children and the role they played in development. I don't want to take it to the extreme and say, infancy and childhood are all that matter. The infancy and childhood prepares us in many ways for the adults we will become, and that has been shaped by natural selection and evolutionary forces as well. And a lot of those forces are operating early on in development. Young organisms, particularly young humans, are sensitive to early environmental conditions. We are most plastic or pliable or changeable during these early stages of development, and thus we can modify our developmental trajectory as a function of current environmental factors in anticipation of future ones. It's not having a crystal ball. It's not saying evolution, natural selection knows where the organism is going, but if we can be sensitive, if organisms can be sensitive to early environmental conditions, they can modify their development if they have the plasticity to essentially anticipate what future environments are going to be like. Sometimes we're wrong. Sometimes future environments aren't like early environments, and there are mismatches there, but oftentimes it's been right.
Yeah, we're going to talk about mismatches later on in the interview. So with evolutionary theory, does it replace other older theories of human development, or does it simply complement them?
I'd like to think it complements them. Um, I think you can be a developmentalist and study human development without studying evolution, if you without taking into consideration. But I think when you do, you're missing uh, much of the richness of human development. I think it certainly it complements an understanding of human development. How did our species evolve to become the species we became? Why might our behaviors be adaptive? How are we different from other species? What evolutionary theory does is provide you with some behaviors that are apt to be important. It focuses you on important behaviors, important aspects of development that are associated with survival, that are associated with understanding the social and physical world, in later ages are associated with mating and parenting. These are important aspects of behavior, of development, of what it means to be human. And evolutionary theory points you to what these important variables, aspects of life might be. So with an evolutionary perspective, you answer in somewhat the why question. Why do we evolve like this? Why might this have been important? And I think that provides a richness to an understanding of development and adulthood, for that matter.
Yeah, I was just thinking about Nico Tinbergen's four questions, and perhaps that's one of the ways we would want to look at the integration between evolution and development. Because development, if we focus on the more proximate aspects of it, we are answering perhaps questions like the ontogeny and how a particular, in this case, mental mechanism functions. And with an evolutionary perspective, we also bring to the table more of an ultimate explanation to things, like answering a question surrounding its phylogeny and also the function it serves.
I fully agree. I fully agree with that. I think Tinbergen was right on target there. We have to look at all these various aspects of development, the proximal as well as the distal explanations, ontogeny as well as phylogeny, what function does it play. On top of that is the integration of ontogeny and phylogeny. Looking at the phylogeny, the evolution of a species to understand an animal's behavior is very important, as is looking at its ontogeny, but we have to keep in mind that our ancestors also developed. And it was changes in the development of our ancestors, of any species' ancestors, that played an important role in its subsequent phylogeny, subsequent evolution.
Mm-hmm.
So it's taking Tinbergen's approach maybe one step further.
Mm-hmm. Right. So by studying child development, can we learn more about the kinds of selective pressures we were subject to during our evolutionary history?
Well, I think we can in a limited sense. One, of course, we can't go back and know precisely what our ancient environments were like, and what the answer you typically get on this question is, well, we have our contemporary hunter-gatherer cultures, and this is the best guess what our ancient environments were like. True, mm-hmm. I fully agree with that. However, infancy in particular and early childhood are very similar, more similar across cultures and across species than any other time. The older we get, the more different we are between cultures and between species. So there's a lot of sort of biological basis, canalization, if you will, to early aspects of development. And these are some of the aspects that all cultures, all animals had to solve. Early attachment, how do infants become attached, mammals in particular, primates in particular, to their parents to foster survival? What are the conditions that the infants have to face? What are conditions and situations the parents have to face? And how much do I invest in these infants or not? What happens with weaning? What happens when a second child comes along? These are things that are similar across cultures. Different cultures have developed certain different alternatives to them, but because of the similarities of individuals early on in development between cultures and even between species, we can get an idea of what the basic demands and pressures were on infants and their parents and other members of the culture. And I think that does give us some greater insight into what some of the pressures were like and some of the conditions were like for our early ancestors.
Mhm. And in comparison to other animals, and in this case the closer ones are the other primates, we have an extended period of development, right?
Yes, we do. The human extension of development is really an extension of the primate pattern in general, but we just take it to a real extreme. And part of this is long-lived species need a lot of time to learn things. And so you need a relatively big brain to do it. And so part of our just extended lifespan is a primate typical feature. Humans do exaggerate this, and the best explanation, or the one that I favor and the one that I think is probably most popular right now, is not for just learning per se, which of course it was. We have to learn the technologies, tool use, but because we became increasingly social. Our sociality is, yes, an extension of great ape sociality, but an extension beyond that. We live in greatly diverse cultures. The rules of cultures have to be particularly, specifically learned. We do live a long time, and so we have to understand relationships, form relationships, and see how they're going to change across time. And because of the complexity of human social relationships, the need to compete and cooperate, both sides of the coin here, it's a social brain hypothesis. And Alexander, Humphreys, Dunbar, sort of most popularized that in earlier decades, is the explanation I like anyway, for the extended extended lifespan and period of development for humans, with much of that important stuff occurring early on in life. The even extension of infancy. It's not really an extension of infancy if you consider infancy time to weaning. Chimps are actually weaned a bit later than humans are. But we are born with a bigger brain right away, and we spend the first, we would normally be, if we follow the chimp pattern, still in utero while the brain is developing very rapidly. This happens post utero for post birth for humans. It's still a stage of infancy, but it's a different stage compared to what chimps experience because of the richness of social and physical environments that this developing brain is experiencing even then. The period of childhood, which Barry Bogan suggests is actually unique to humans between weaning and the juvenile period, has associated with it the beginning about 3 years of age, certainly 2 years of age anyway, language, symbolism. We see symbolic play coming in. We see the increased social cooperation and collaboration coming in, maybe a little bit later, but the beginnings of it here. In-group, out-group distinctions. Our sociality is changing quite substantially. And Bogan proposes that adolescence is also a unique human stage, this period between the end of the juvenile period and the beginning of adulthood, which I guess many species have to some extent. It's exaggerated in humans, and a period that's associated with increased attention to sexuality, to mating, to becoming adults. But you need a little more time. Humans need a little more time to become successful adults. And this period of adolescence gives it to them. Increased risk-taking, separation from parents, etc. So humans' extended lifespan, in one sense, is an extension of primate life history, but it's done in almost a qualitatively different way, with these starting with infancy and so much rapid brain development occurring postnatally, and then with the sort of introduced period of childhood and even an extended juvenile period, and then adolescence.
Mm-hmm. So, are humans a neotenous species, and what does that mean?
Well, neoteny is literally the retention of infantile or juvenile characteristics into later development, or the retention of characteristics from an earlier ancestors into later development. And for a long time, there have been theorists who propose that humans are a very neotenous species, in the sense that many aspects of human development are retarded or slowed down. And this seems counterintuitive at first, because we are, of course, more advanced, at least we think of ourselves that way, certainly intellectually, relative to other species. But how did we get that way? Neoteny is one example of a form of heterochrony, which is genetic control of aspects of development, differential timing of development of different modules of development, if you will. If you think of a body, including the brain, as being different components or modules, they can develop at different rates. We don't develop like a balloon, everything as it expands, developing at the same time. Different aspects of our physical development, as well as our psychological, that is, and thus brain development, occur at different rates. So heterochrony refers to these differential rates, especially relative to an ancestor. Some rates may be faster, some may be slower relative to an ancestor, some aspects may be extended, early aspects of development extended later into development. And neoteny is a form of pediamorphosis, or slowing. I'm using the term a little more generally for slowing of development or retardation of development. And the example I gave about the human brain, infant brain, is often viewed as a neotenous characteristic. Yes, the brain is bigger than that of a chimpanzee and presumably our ancient ancestors, but it got that way first by extending the period in which neurogenesis occurs prenatally, so we have more brain cells than chimpanzees do to begin with, and then extending the rate of growth that is rapid during the prenatal period for all primates into postnatal life. The explanation for this usually is human brains were just getting too big. They couldn't fit through the birth canal of a bipedal woman, so babies had to be born early to prevent not being born at all. Then the rapid rate of growth of synaptogenesis, increasing the size of neurons, continued into postnatal life. So this is often considered a neotenous characteristic. Other physical features of humans seem to reflect a slowing of development. Our facial characteristics, we look very babyish compared to adult chimpanzees or other species. So there's a whole list of neotenous characteristics. So this has caused some theorists, Volk back in the 20s, a Dutch anatomist, probably most extreme example, Montague in the middle of the last century, probably the most ardent proponent of neoteny, to suggest that humans are indeed a neotenous characteristic. We are slow developers. That's a bit of an exaggeration. I think neoteny plays a very important role. I'm sort of a fan of humans as a neotenous species, but it's not all we are. Many aspects of development can be thought of as accelerations relative to some of our ancestors, others more delayed. It is a mosaic pattern, but this is true of many species in general, so this is nothing unique to humans. What seems to be unique to humans is the slow rate of development relative to other species, retaining some of these infantile, juvenile characteristics later on into childhood, some adulthood. For example, there's some evidence that brain plasticity, neuronal plasticity, which peaks in chimpanzees in childhood, doesn't peak in humans until adolescence or into adulthood. We retain this sort of juvenile features of plasticity at the neuronal level. I think of it as neuronal neoteny. So at some very important levels, we are a neotenous species. And I emphasize that because it is counterintuitive. I don't want us to think as Bolk did, of thinking of humans as sort of ape fetuses that have grown up. It's really not a very pleasant thought. But as a species that has become the species we are, physically and behaviorally, through a slowing of development and a retention of early features. Let me mention one thing that is sort of a recent discovery of mine in the last couple of years, is Wrangham's theory about neoteny playing a role in our sociality, in the sense that we have self-domesticated ourselves by becoming less reactively aggressive. We've retained a sort of a non-aggressive in terms of reaction, got to respond right away. And this reduction in reactive aggression permitted us to get along in relatively large groups of individuals that chimpanzees just can't do. We sort of self-domesticated ourselves. What's controversial or interesting about Wrangham's ideas is that we still have a lot of proactive aggression. We can think about it, and we can actually punish. And his idea was we probably executed people who broke some of these rules. So we don't lose our aggression, just some of our reactive aggression through this process of neoteny or pediomorphosis, as Wrangham refers to it.
Mm-hmm. So do humans have high levels of behavioral plasticity in comparison to other species?
We seem to, at least broadly defined. There are limits, of course. Other species you can think of as being very plastic and that they really can change a lot, but in very limited context. For humans, at least for cognition, for learning, for brain-based aspects, we are a highly plastic species. All primates, all mammals, I think, are most plastic brain-wise, changes of behavior, cognition, early in development. We lose that plasticity, we all do as we age. Humans do as well. Your brain is not as plastic as it was 20, 30 years ago. Mine is even less so. But we as adults still retain much of this plasticity, more so than other species. This plasticity is very important for animals that are dependent on learning. So you see this high level of plasticity in other long-lived, particularly social animals. It is critical if you're going to be living as members of a species in diverse environments with great climate change. You don't know exactly what your environment is going to be. You're a generalist. This requires being able to change, being able to identify or be responsive to changes in environments. Humans, I think human plasticity, particularly early in development, is really the key to humans, the story of humanity, in a sense. So yes, humans are highly plastic species. Neurologically, it's not unlimited. It does decrease with age, but it has permitted us to be the species that we are.
Mm-hmm. But by us having higher levels of behavioral plasticity, does that mean that we respond more or are more permeable to environmental influences than other species?
Well, I think it does. Now, there are, of course, constraints, on plasticity. We are not infinitely plastic. an infinitely plastic species would be an example of extreme environmentalism. If we believed in that, here we have the human brain, which is just a nice brain that's a good general learner, and it will mold itself to whatever environmental experiences it has. We are highly plastic, but the plasticity is constrained. Some things are easier or more possible for us to learn than others. We are more apt to develop in X direction versus Y direction than others. It's certainly not unlimited. If it were, you wouldn't see the uniformity we see in species. Most of us develop in a species-typical way because we inherit a species-typical genome plus a species-typical environment. Now, that species-typical environment can vary quite widely, so we can have people growing up in very different cultures who become very different types of adults, but we are still demonstrably human. It's not extremes. The extremes we can see when we have extreme environmental limits of plasticity. We can see when we have extreme environmental conditions. These are unfortunately usually negative, children being in stultifying institutions. What we saw with Romanian institutionalized children several decades ago. These are now, people are now adults in their 30s, and we can see the long-term effects of this. At the real extremes, we have the cases of feral children, which always have to be taken with a grain of salt because of, well, for a lot of reasons. But the fact that human children can be raised seemingly, at least for some period of time, by wolves or monkeys and still stay alive shows an amazing degree of plasticity. The fact that once they are discovered and brought back into humanity, into civilization, that they show relatively little ability to switch, to become fully civilized, so to speak, shows the limits of it. Now, these are real extremes. But if you take a look at the variety of parenting practices, for example, across cultures, you can see that children in very child-friendly, child-loving cultures versus cultures that are quite view children as should be seen and not heard. Children owe it to their parents, and it can be quite harsh. They all grow up, many of them grow up to be, anyway, functional members of their society. You don't have to be super parents in any species general way to raise successful children. So this shows us there's a good deal of plasticity. It also shows that it's hard to make some of these changes later on in life. It's not unlimited.
Mm-hmm. Is the concept of innateness important or relevant for us to understand the development of certain psychological traits? Because I've already talked on the show with different people, and it seems that different people have different definitions of what is innate. Some people mean by innate that it has to be present at birth. Others, not necessarily at birth, but they say that it has to come online in a particular stage of development that is the same across all people. So is this a useful way of thinking about things?
Well, I think it can be, but you've got to be cautious. Many developmentalists, including myself, really don't like the term or the idea of innateness, partially for the reasons you just suggested. It means different things to different people. And using the word implies, I think, we know more than what we really know. You're not sure how the person is using it, for one thing, and whether it is present at birth, whether it is, I think, more useful definition, it develops in a species-typical way, timing-wise, across situations. That can be more useful, but it can still imply more than what's intended. I prefer to think about species-typical characteristics, species-typical features that will evolve, or rather will develop in pretty much the same way, at pretty much the same time across all individuals of the species, given a species-typical environment. This way, you're not saying it's all in the genes, it's all in the environment. It's in somehow an interaction of genes and environment. But if a child does not receive a species-typical experience and thus doesn't develop in a species-typical way, does that child not have instincts? If you really believe in innateness, where is it? So you need this combination, this interaction of genes and environment, experience and biology to understand normal human development. And I think you can, using the word innate too freely sometimes can mask what is really going on. If you say something is innate, it implies anyway, to most people, it's there, there's nothing you can do about it, it's in the genes, and we understand it now. And maybe you don't. Maybe you don't understand it as well as you could. It implies more knowledge than you probably actually have. So I think people use it in well-intentioned ways, but because there are different definitions of it, I think thinking about species-typical characteristics is a better way of expressing these things that we sometimes use the word innateness for.
Mm-hmm. Is behavioral genetics relevant to our discussion? I mean, do you also take into account discoveries from behavioral genetics and maybe individual variation when it comes to these psychological traits?
Oh, heavens, yes. Genes are important. Genes are critical. And behavioral genetics looks at the relationship between genes and the expression of those genes and behavior. So yes, I think any account that ignores behavioral genetics or genetics in general is missing an important part of the story. But you've got to be careful because you don't want to give all the potency to genes themselves, which I think some people who read the genetic literature or even do the genetic research are apt to do, probably unintentionally. Genes are always expressed in a context. Mm-hmm. That context alters the expression, can alter the expression of genes. The individual differences in genes, different alleles associated with different outcomes, sometimes only make a difference in certain environments. Knowing that is very important. Knowing the genes behind a certain behavior or a certain physical characteristic is very important. But understanding that those same alleles will be expressed differently in different environmental contexts is critical as well. And then this brings us to the new field of epigenetics. I say it's new. It's been around for a long time. But biologists are now recognizing the importance of epigenetic factors, particularly the process of methylation, in modifying gene expression as a function of experience. It's not just epigenetic factors around the early stages of development, but it's epigenetic factors continuing throughout life, turning on, turning off genes, affecting how much gene products, proteins essentially, are produced by a gene under certain context. So these are really exciting trends. If I were going to start over again, I want to have a career in studying behavioral epigenetics. I think it's really going to be an exciting interaction between experience, genetics, and will give us greater insight into the nature of development itself. So the answer to your question is, I guess, yes, behavioral genetics are very important, but they have to be considered in the context of essentially the rearing environment or the environment in general of the organism.
Mm-hmm. So a very important part of human childhood seems to be play. Do we know why play evolved and what are the sorts of functions that it serves?
We certainly have a lot of theories about it. And play is something that has confounded people for a while. One definition of play, or one characteristic definition, one feature of it, is that it's purposeless. You don't do it for any real reason other than doing it itself. But no one who studies play believes it's purposeless, as it turns out. It has a function, maybe just not the immediate function of increasing fitness. But through play, and there's different types of play, and you develop certain skills, physical skills, social skills. We see this in all social animals. There is at least rough and tumble play, locomotor play, chase games that may be very helpful and useful in developing important social skills later on for species. Animals who are prevented from playing as juveniles often are socially less competent than animals that are provided opportunities for play. In humans, physical play with objects seems to be very important for tool use. We see tool use in other great apes as well, and chimpanzees, orangutans, some gorillas, some, and they show object play as juveniles. This seems very important in humans as well, learning the affordances of objects, which tends to be foster discovering properties that can be used as with artifacts, particularly tools. But in humans, the prototypic play is sociodramatic play, which involves counterfactual thinking, pretend. And this seems to be very critical in humans. You don't see it in other species. The closest you get in chimpanzees, for example, maybe some hints of it where there's been observations of chimps carrying a log around and sort of pretending it's a baby. You got to read a lot into that. You see some evidence of what looks like sociodramatic or pretend play in some enculturated chimpanzees, human-reared chimpanzees, but it's not species typical. In humans, it's species typical. I have a 3-year-old granddaughter right now who's just starting this sociodramatic play, who's playing with her horses and pretending little horses. And it's just wonderful to see. She's right on schedule. This is what 3-year-olds begin to do, sometimes a little earlier, sometimes a little later. And then eventually you get social interactions. This sociodramatic play, this counterfactual thinking. These aren't real horses. They're not real. Horses aren't talking to one another. I'm not really a space person, an astronaut, but I'm pretending to be. Is an expression of our symbolic abilities and helps us deal with counterfactual thinking, acting as if something's true when it's not, which seems to be a very important human skill. And I think when it's done in a social context, you're developing social relations as well, having to anticipate what someone else is thinking, how it fits with what you're thinking, what you're supposed to do, what they're supposed to do, etc. So there are lots of theories of why play is found, mainly in social animals, developing physical skills in a relatively safe environment, developing motor skills and exercise, again, in a relatively safe environment. And for humans, sociodramatic play, exercising and developing our symbolic skills and social cognitive skills. And we find there's recent evidence the last decade or so that the more children engage in sociodramatic play, it tends to have facilitating effects on things like executive function, language development, if they use a lot of language in their play. There are correlations. There may be other explanations for them, but play seems to have an important role in a lot of human social and cognitive functions.
Mm-hmm. So is play also connected to learning?
Oh yes. If you look at particularly traditional cultures, there's very little explicit teaching in traditional cultures. That is, adults teaching children. There's some, but not a heck of a lot. And for me, at first, learning but we're the teaching species. This is natural for us. This is why we do so well. We've mastered culture and inventions. We teach one another. Hunter-gatherers don't do a lot of this. When it's done, it's more apt to be done older children to younger children. There's a recent study just confirming this or demonstrating this again in a couple of traditional groups. A lot of learning goes on during play. So a lot of it is social learning. A lot of it is learning in traditional cultures. adult skills like hunting or gathering or cooking. It's done during play, younger children playing with older children primarily, sometimes adults playing with young children. And of course, observational learning, which is not play, which is just learning by observing, and that seems to be very important as well. But play, a lot of things are discovered during play, in the process of discovery, manipulating things. Oh, look what this does. I've learned something new about this thing, or this contraption. But also social relationships, and again, some very important survival skills. So play still plays a role in learning in modern cultures. Certainly it's less of a role than it did for our ancestors, seemingly hunter-gatherers, where it seems to be more primary, but play has been and continues to be an important learning device, learning mechanism for our species.
Mm-hmm. So later in the interview we're going to come back to evolutionary mismatch, but would you say that nowadays in modern industrialized societies children don't play as much as they should, and that perhaps brings about some issues that we're seeing?
Well, I think you're right. They don't play as they should, so to speak. I shouldn't use the word should here. But certainly formal education, formal schooling, especially, sit down in chairs and listen to the teacher. There's very little play in school compared to what they used to be. Schools, the last 3 or 4 decades in the United States anyway, have been getting rid of recess, where children had breaks that just the break itself, and getting rid of using some energy may have benefits, particularly on inhibition abilities, but also opportunities to play. So formal schooling, formal education is reducing children's opportunity to play. And then there's a tendency, we see it again strongly in the United States, but you see it in other Western countries as well, or weird cultures. Children are playing less on their own, free play. Go out and, when I was a kid, my parents would often say, go outside and play. They didn't tell us what to play, just the inference was, go find some other kids and do something. Play, You're seeing less and less of that. There are play dates that parents schedule. There are more formal games. You're going to be part of Little League or Pee Wee basketball or whatever, and formal games where someone else makes the rules. This is play as well, but it's reduces the amount of freedom they have. Children don't get a chance to sort of make rules. Piaget said moral development really occurs when children have to interact with one another. They have disagreements. Have to solve them. This is normal part of development. So in industrialized countries, we're seeing less of this type of play. Kids are on their tablets a lot. They are playing. They may be playing more in the recent decade just because of the video games. And some of that is social, and you're playing with other children, other people, other players in these games. But it's not face to face. It's not the same type of relationships you have. So yes, I think the reduction of free play in particular is probably not a good thing in current societies. And I think particularly early in development, young children should be encouraged to give them the opportunity to play more on their own, especially with other children.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Piaget, and by the way, has Piaget fallen out of fashion in developmental psychology? Or, what are the kinds of things he got wrong and the ones he got right, perhaps?
Well, there are probably too many things to mention about the things he got right. We take much of cognitive development that Piaget gave to us sort of for granted today. Piaget studied very high-level aspects of cognition in children, not the sort of lower-level, almost intuitive implicit aspects that dominated adult cognitive psychology through much of the 20th century. He made it clear to us that children's cognition the children play an active role in their own cognition, the active nature of the child. He discovered more basic phenomena than I think any other developmental psychologist. Conservation from infancy through adolescence. He provided explanations for why development may change. His equilibration model, for example. So he got so much right. And even if we want to disagree with the details, his overall description of the general nature of how children change from infancy to adolescence still feels right, at least at the macro level. Now, his theory, he began the theory about 100 years ago. So the fact that, we're talking about a theorist who started his career in the 1920s and we're doing it in the 2020s is still pretty impressive. But things change. Piaget, over in the United States anyway, and then later I think in the rest of the world, there was this conflict between Piagetian perspectives and information processing perspectives, a little more mechanistic perspective. And information processing sort of caught on, and some people tried to integrate Piaget with information processing approaches. Others saw them as contradictory. So there was that general trend. Piaget couldn't quite be explained in these new ways as easily as before. Piaget tended to underestimate a lot of children's abilities. Infants, especially using some of these new techniques, habituation, dishabituation paradigms, some of the information processing paradigms, slightly older children. Children and infants have more abilities than Piaget inferred. When you look closely, for example, they can be trained to 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds can be trained to conserve, which Piaget said you shouldn't. That shouldn't happen. The whole nature of stages was questioned. Development seems to be more continuous than Piaget proposed it, and less homogeneous within a stage. So for these and some other reasons, Piaget became a bit out of fashion as new theories and new ways of looking at development, or cognitive development, emerged. But I haven't taken Piaget out of my textbook yet. I used to give him a chapter all to himself. He now shares it with others, but it's still the bulk of the chapter. Cognitive development can't be properly understood without looking at Piaget's contributions. So he is the background. His ideas, I think, are the background for much of what contemporary cognitive developmentalists are studying and trying to understand today. But yes, there are very few people who say, well, I'm a Piagetian, and here we go. There are people who will cite Piaget and his background material, but he is part of our DNA, so to speak. It may not always be explicitly expressed, but his ideas were the foundation for much of what contemporary developmental cognitive people do today.
Mm-hmm. So another question, does child development have anything to do with the evolution of culture?
Well, yes, in some sense. Culture, first of all, you have to look at culture as evolving along with biological evolution. Culture is often seen as opposed to evolution. If you have a cultural explanation, it's the antithesis of an evolutionary explanation. And that's just not right. Humans, as long as there have been humans, have been cultural species. And so we have to look at biologic cultural coevolution. And there are theorists and people who spent their careers doing just that. But within cultures, within our species, you always have to contend with the very important issue of raising children. because humans are slow developers, because we are so dependent on adults for so long as infants and children. There have to be cultural solutions to those problems. How do different cultures handle it? And depending on the ecological conditions that a culture finds itself in, or maybe its history, there have been different solutions to those problems. And so knowing what an infant needs and knowing what a 4-year-old, 6-year-old, or 12-year-old is like as a member of a species, how do different cultures with different ecologies deal with these issues of keeping them alive, getting them socialized so they can become functional members of their society. So yes, I think culture and evolution and development are certainly integrated. You have to look at them together. And there has been, as you well know, most of psychological research has been so-called weird cultures, Western educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. And to what extent do children growing up in Portugal or the United States reflect children growing up, in Papua New Guinea or the Amazon? And do we care? What difference does it make? Well, it makes a difference. What characterizes us as a species versus us as members of a particular type of culture? These are important issues. And so there's been an increased emphasis on studying children in development in different cultures, from different weird cultures with slightly different cultural histories to the extent that that's possible, more traditional cultures. There are only a handful of true hunter-gatherer cultures left. And most work with hunter-gatherers or really with former hunter-gatherers who are now usually agriculturalists or horticulturalists. But these types of studies are looking at, do some of these abilities that we think are so important that we're recently discovering or maybe had discovered ages ago, do they develop under the same conditions in these various cultures? And when there's variation, can we explain that variation by the ecology of a particular culture or the cultural history? So it gets very Vygotsky in a sense. It integrates Vygotsky with Darwin, with Piaget, so to speak, in a very broad way.
Yeah, and talking about raising children, have mothers played an important role in our evolution? I mean, could we say that they were responsible for the evolution of certain of our evolved psychological traits?
Well, as a mammal, for all mammals, saying mothers matter is sort of trivial. Of course they matter. The way mammals develop, it's gestation and conception occur within the female. She's the only one who can nurse, essentially provide nutrition for babies. Yes, other lactating females can, but it's usually the mother. So of course mothers are important. But from a broader sense, an evolutionary sense, I think they're even more important. They're more than just 50% of the DNA and the mechanism by which babies are fed. If we go back to our earlier discussion of plasticity, infants, young children are highly plastic, highly pliable, and it is changes early in life that essentially alter the course of development, which provide different niches, if you will, for natural selection to occur, different characteristics. Mothers, for mammals, and humans for an extended period of time, are the environment for these young infants, for these young plastic organisms. It is going to be mother's behavior more than anything else that is going to be the cues for infants and young children to change. This means that changes in maternal behavior, changes in parenting, really changes in mothering, because fathers in most mammals, there are a few exceptions, but most mammals have really very little to do with babies and young infants. It is going to be the mother's behavior that is going to be the mechanism, the basis by which plasticity can be expressed in the young. So I've used research in with enculturated apes as an example for this, that apes that are brought up by humans, treated much as human babies are treated, they show, and Mike Tomasello and some of his colleagues and others have done some of this work as well, these enculturated young chimpanzees, sometimes orangutans, gorillas, show more advanced social cognition than mother-reared apes. Suggesting that if our common ancestors with chimpanzees had the same level of plasticity and flexibility, changes in maternal behavior, and if you had a group of mothers who were a little more responsive in a human-type way, maybe engaged in shared attention behaviors with their babies, maybe grunted more towards them, used vocalizations a little bit more, maybe engaged in a little more teaching than is typically done by contemporary mother-reared chimps, which happens, but just not very frequently. These mothers could have been the mechanisms by which infants could have changed, and if there are enough infants in a group to change, you change the selective pressures, and so these more highly social cognitive individuals could, be the beginning of evolutionary changes in the species. So yes, I think mothers are very important in the sense that they provide not only the DNA, a little more DNA because of the mitochondria, but also the early environment for a highly plastic animal.
Mm-hmm. So we've already talked a little bit about this earlier, but talking about the new stages of development that the human species shows, like for example childhood and adolescence, did they bring along with them new sets of psychological traits or not? Because earlier when we were talking about stages and Piaget, one of the things you said we probably got wrong is that there aren't really discrete stages with a set of psychological abilities that occur in that particular stage or come online in that particular stage, but they are continuous.
Well, I may have overstated that a little bit. Let me.
Okay.
Stages are, I think, convenient fictions. In Piaget's sense, I don't think behavior cognition isn't quite as homogeneous within a stage as Piaget proposed. It's more context dependent. There was a lot of intra-individual differences. Piaget overstated that, or we interpreted Piaget as overstating that. There's a lot of things we say Piaget got wrong that I think we just interpreted Piaget incorrectly. Nonetheless, most 4-year-olds behave pretty much the same most of the time as other 4-year-olds, as do most 8-year-olds. There's probably more homogeneity than an information processing contextual theory would suggest. So stages, development is a continuous process, but within a certain age period, usually behavior is somewhat homogeneous. Sometimes they are indicated by real biological changes. Infancy, one way of defining infancy is birth to weaning. Now, weaning can occur at different ages for different members of a species, but you take a look at what weaning would be like in traditional cultures, we're talking about 3 years of age. Adrenalarchy, or adrenarchy, occurring, the activation of the adrenal gland sort of defines the beginning of the juvenile period. Puberty with the activation of hormones, from the sex hormones. Androgen, estrogen. So we can use these as markers to some extent, meaning stages have some basis in biological reality. So the concept of stage can't be taken as literally as it used to. These are discontinuous, discrete times, and there's total homogeneity within these particular stages. But I think they can be useful in taking a look at what characterizes an organism or set of organisms, members of a species, between a particular set of ages or a particular set of biologic events, weaning and adrenalarchy, for example, that differentiated from, on average, members of at other ages or other characteristics. So this is trying to have my cake and eat it too. Stages are not real in the sense that development is continuous, but they are, the convenient fictions that are the stage-like activities. From Bogan's perspective and how other people have interpreted some of Bogan's work, these stages bring along with it different cognitive abilities, or at least opportunities to express different cognitive abilities. Direction of causality is always difficult. Do these new stages bring along these cognitive abilities, or because of these cognitive abilities are merging, did they require the invention of new stages? It's got to be a bidirectional type of phenomenon. We see the increasing brain size in humans and different organizations occurring, over the preschool years, new abilities, cognitive abilities emerging, and they're going to emerge for the most part in almost any kind of species-typical environment, even one where play is limited. But when children become 3 and their brain development is relatively normal, and brain development is highly canalized for the first couple of years anyway. Yes, with extreme deprivation, you don't get normal development, but in the absence of extreme deprivation, eventually children are going to acquire a language, they're going to develop the basic symbolic skills. And if after 18 months of deprivation they are exposed to a species typical environment, there's a good chance that they can find reversals. After this, it's a lot tougher. But once you have a child, let's say 3.5 years of age, brought up in a species typical environment, who now has these more advanced cognitive abilities, play, for example, sociodramatic play, gives them opportunities to exercise them, to develop them, for them to emerge, if you will, into more advanced social cognitive skills. So, and this can feed back, or could have fed back in our ancestors on the necessity for increasing brain size, because as social complexity increased and the necessity to deal with other members of the species, this produces pressure for increased brain size to handle it. So, I like to think of, for the social brain hypothesis, adding development in there as well, that animals that live in highly socially complex environments need large brains to handle these social skills, but they need a long time to acquire the social skills that are going to be pertinent in their society, because especially in humans of the variability. We all may be moral members of a species. We all develop a sense of morality, but what that morality is highly dependent on culture. What the social rules are for interactions. We are all highly social members of a species, but those rules differ often greatly between cultures. We need a lot of time and practice to develop these skills. So I think of the social brain hypothesis involving large brain, extended period of development, and social complexity interacting bidirectionally across time and across evolutionary time.
Mm-hmm. But do we know what came first? I mean, if it was our social complexity, our slow development, is that the best way of thinking about it, that one thing came before the other?
Well, I don't think we'll ever know, because they are so hopelessly confounded. You might think the social complexity would have come first, and animals that happen to have slightly larger brains that allowed them to be slightly more capable within socially complex environments had the advantage. Well, then, is it the larger brain, or is it the social complexity? So I think it's really difficult to pinpoint which came first. I think the better way of looking at it is these are emergent properties that change over time, that with one factor interacting and affecting the other. So at times there may have been increasing pressure, greater pressure for brain growth, at other times greater pressure for extended period, but they are all dependent on all three of these factors simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. Should we also consider sex differences in development? Are there any important sex differences in human development?
Well, I think so. This can get one in trouble somewhat today, proposing sex differences. But if you take a look at the fact that we're mammals, there is in all mammals, there is greater obligatory female investment. This goes back to Trivers' parental investment theory. It goes back to Darwin eventually. Almost all things go back to Darwin. And so it is not surprising that some of these sex differences are associated with early attachment behaviors. The effect of the Kinchin schema, Lorenz's babiness, we really get like cute baby faces, we fall in love with cute babies, etc. This seems to be a bit stronger in women than in men. There's even now neurological evidence that different areas of the brain sort of light up more in women than in men, and mothers for their own children than for other children. We shouldn't be surprised at some of these things. Sex differences seem to be important in play. You see both boys and girls developing across cultures. Sociodramatic play beginning around 3 years of age. The girls' play tends to be a little more sophisticated, at least some studies find it. But what differs mainly, and you see this across cultures, is the themes in the play. In boys, the themes seem to be more dominance. When I was a kid, it was cowboys and Indians, cops and robbers. Today, it's superheroes. And one dominating the other. In children and girls, it tends to be more domestic related or cooperation related. Mom playing house, playing teacher. These are not inevitable. Different environments produce different pressures for boys versus girls to go this way. There are, of course, individual differences in individual boys and girls that are probably related to biological differences, be they genes, prenatal hormone exposure. So the sex differences, the fact that there are some relatively robust, consistent sex differences doesn't mean biology is destiny. These sex differences are differentially supported in some cultures, in some environments versus others. They need to be supported by opportunities for certain types of play, certain types of experiences. But the fact that they're there shouldn't be all that surprising. The fact that we can overcome them, modern societies is increasingly emphasizing egalitarianism, particularly with respect to sex differences. And I think that's a very good thing, and there's nothing in our biology that says this is not possible. That there are biases for girls to develop one way and boys to develop others, given certain species-typical environments, I think is still true. But it doesn't dictate how girls or boys in a particular culture should develop. So yes, I think sex differences are present. I think they're sort of important in understanding some differences we see in boys and girls and what the types of play and types of activities boys and girls tend to prefer, but it shouldn't be used as a say, well, from a biological perspective, girls shouldn't be interested in engineering. Well, girls may not be as interested in engineering on average as boys, and maybe for some biologic reasons, but some girls certainly are. And some girls will certainly have the abilities and the interests, and they should certainly be encouraged.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Okay, so now talking about another important theory in, I guess, developmental and evolutionary psychology, What about attachment theory? Are there any insights that we can get through attachment theory that we wouldn't get from traditional, let's say, evolutionary theory and other theories in developmental psychology?
Well, if you go back to the originator of attachment theory, John Bowlby, his was sort of a neo-Freudian theory, but also an evolutionary theory. So from its very origins, attachment theory was sort of a mid-level evolutionary theory. So it fits in very nicely. You know, I don't see it as separate. And Bowlby noted, you know, quite accurately that behavior of young animals was directed towards dependency, if you will, usually with its mother, with other members of the species to stay alive. It's a survival strategy. And this benefits certainly babies who need, particularly human babies, who need care and attention for an extended period of time in order to stay alive and become independent themselves. But of course, the parents as well, particularly mothers, but fathers as well, who need to get their genes out into the next generation. You know, from a strictly gene-centric perspective, if you have an animal who was born highly dependent, it takes a long time to develop, there has to be some way of that animal getting the attention it needs. And so children developed, and this is Triver's term, psychological weapons. I really love that concept for getting their parents, particularly their mothers, to attend to them, to fall in love with them, to care for them. Parents have their own set of psychological weapons in a sense, because although it's in the child's best interest and the parents' best interest for their kids to develop into functional adults themselves, survival is everything for the infant, for the child. But parents have to consider their own survival. They have to consider investing not just in this particular child, but other children they may currently have or other children they may have in the future. How much do I invest in this child right now versus his brothers and sisters or versus children I may have in the future? So it's not an equal game, so to speak. They're both involved, interested in the child's survival, but the child especially so. And so parents have evolved, and you see this traditional cultures, particularly in how much do I invest in my child. You see it today, you know, across the globe as well. Tables can turn somewhat. In very affluent cultures and affluent families, we often see high levels of investment in high-risk kids. Children with intellectual deficits in one way or another often get an awful lot of attention because their parents can afford this. In generations past, children with intellectual deficits, physical deficits, often were invested in less, often given over as wards of the state. You saw this at the extreme in Romania under Ceausescu. And parents, especially with fewer resources, invested in their healthy children. So these are decisions that are dependent on ecological factors as well. How much resources do I have? But attachment theory and attachment itself are some of the mechanisms by which children essentially try to ensure their own survival.
Mm-hmm. So before we get into evolutionary mismatch, particularly in modern industrialized societies, let me just ask you another question. So comparing to other species, what would you say are the most distinct social traits of humans?
Well, we are primates. We are social primates and share a lot of our, you know, social cognition with chimpanzees and bonobos, for example. But we go far beyond them. And probably first of all, we're cultural animals. Chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, yes, have culture in the sense they pass on non-genetic information from one species to the next. But our cultures are much more complex, much more diverse. and so much variable from one culture to the next. So we are very sensitive to individual differences in group behavior. We identify with our own culture very well. We're artifact using species, tools. Other species use tools. We invent tools. We use tools much more so than other species. How do we learn to do this? Mainly it's through social learning. So our social learning is geared to both acquiring social norms, what do people like me do, other members of the culture, and to acquiring artifact use, watching how someone else uses an artifact, use a tool. Our social learning, particularly over imitation, we will exaggerate, we will imitate every aspect of a ritual or an action on an artifact, even if it's not necessary, so to speak. It's a best bet for learning these things. So in one sense, we are a cultural and thus in-group, out-group, especially social learning animal. Other species have this, but we have it to an exaggeration. The distinction that is probably, the social cognitive distinction that's probably most outstanding is our ability to cooperate with one another. We are a cooperative species. I mentioned Wrangham's idea of self-domestication. We became less reactively aggressive so we could interact more peacefully, so to speak, with other members of the species, so we could cooperate with one another, so we could work together to achieve joint goals that one of us could not achieve by ourselves. We see the beginning of this, again, really about 3 years of age. There are little hints before it. Michael Tomasello and his colleagues have really pushed this idea and done lots of research in children and chimpanzees, showing that chimps both cooperate with one another if necessary. But if two chimps have to work to achieve a goal, but one chimp can achieve the goal by itself, cooperation isn't necessary, they won't bother. Or they don't share. If they cooperate to get a goal, to get some treats, and one chimp happens to get all 3 of the treats, the other chimp gets none, they don't necessarily share it. Then cooperation ends. Humans can cooperate, but when we do, we cooperate, quote, fairly. And you see this beginning certainly by 3 years of age. It improves throughout childhood to 5, 6, 7 years of age. And this is what has really made us a special species, our ability to cooperate. We still compete. We're not a kumbaya species. Let's cooperate with all of one another and we're one big happy family. We're not. We compete a lot within a group, and perhaps, and David Sloan Wilson emphasizes this perhaps the most or maybe the best, we cooperate within a group to compete with other groups effectively very well. Groups that cooperate with one another are more successful groups and cooperate less well with one another. So this is a group, it's not quite an old-fashioned group selection theory, but it's a modern version of group selection theory, multi-level selection, Wilson calls it. So I think these factors, social learning, the notion of in-group, out-group distinctions and becoming members of groups easily, identifying who's a group member, who's not, and then adapting our behavior accordingly, and then cooperation, the ability to cooperate are not quite unique, but specially evolved and developed social cognitive abilities.
Mm-hmm. Right. So in the book you mentioned several different examples of things or behaviors that we find in modern weird societies that we could refer to as evolutionary mismatches. So for example, you mentioned social media, hyper-individualism, and formal educational practices. Could you explain that?
Sure. Let's take social media for a start. In one sense, social media is a really good match for our evolved characteristics. It's highly social. We're highly social. You get feedback right away. It's a match. It's almost a super science stimulus. It's why we know that there are problems with some teenagers and young adults anyway, with excessive use of social media. It's associated with higher levels of anxiety, of depression. Not for all, but for many. Why do we use it so much if it doesn't make us feel good? In the few experiments that have been done, okay, you can't be on social media any more than 10 minutes a day, or when you're on it, you just comment, you don't write your own. People feel better after being off social media or not interacting with it so intimately. If it makes us feel worse, why do we engage in it? And it's because it's such a strong, almost super science stimulus. It matches our social needs. But to this extent, it can be a mismatch because it can prevent us as, it can be associated with things like fear of being left out. What am I missing? Look what everyone else is doing, and I'm not doing this. I've got to stay in tune. On social media, we present our best selves. We can go through all kinds of photos until we find one that makes us look good. We talk about things that make us look good. Look how interesting my life is. And we do it ourselves, but we see what a good life everyone else is having, and how come I'm not as successful, as happy, as interesting as these people. So it can be associated with some negative feelings. Of course, the cyberbullying as well. This is the mismatch. And it also can prevent us, if we do too much of it, from face-to-face social interactions. Mm-hmm. You see that within families, people around the dinner table, everyone's on their phone. That's within a family. You see adolescents, teenagers, young adults out together as a group, they're all on their phones. There's less social give and take. And to some extent, there is evidence that some children anyway, some adolescents, young adults are less socially skilled. At extremes, you get pornography, and people who are young men who have a very heavy diet of pornography, have a very difficult time developing a normal sexual relation with a real life woman. This is not, I don't know what to do. This doesn't seem quite right. We need to interact with others, not just face-to-face online, but with others. And we're losing some of those experiences, at least some people are. So Jean Twenge has reviewed much of this work, which he calls the iGeners, people who grow up with essentially a smartphone in their hands, and has documented a lot of the negative side of things. There are positives as well. Don't get me wrong. Social media has been wonderful in many respects during the pandemic. We can stay in touch with other people that we couldn't do, or shouldn't do anyway, face-to-face. So there have been real benefits to it as well. It's not all bad news, but it can have negative consequences when taken to extremes, which it sometimes is in many cultures. In terms of hyper-individualism, the United States is probably the most extreme on this, so you see this in other weird cultures as well, particularly sort of Anglo cultures. Australia, you see it, Great Britain, I think. I'm not sure how, my guess is Portugal. I know Spain's a little less so, certainly, than the US.
Yeah, I think we are closer to Spain.
Yeah, so I would think so. I think that's a good thing, at least for psychological development. We've evolved as a social species, and the emphasis in the US, particularly on individualism, on individual success, causes difficulty. We are not encouraged to collaborate with others as much as we can. And then growing up, we miss some of this. And it makes us susceptible to messages and groups that says, be one of us. You can believe in this. Look at all the support you have here. When that support isn't coming from more positive role models or more positive groups, what they used to get in church groups and Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, in community situations, in extended families. Some individuals, and it turns out to be quite a lot of individuals, are susceptible to I say we'll call it misinformation. That's a popular term in the culture right now. But you share my goals, my beliefs, my feelings. You're one of us, and I think that can have negative consequences. And then there's a whole social psychological set of findings and theories and explanations for why people buy into these non-socially typical groups and conspiracy theories and gangs, so to speak. There are good reasons for it. And I think this is a mismatch as well. In terms of education, I am particularly, I like to emphasize early education. We see, again, in the U.S., a lot of emphasis, and this has been going on for a long time, on pushing formal education back and back and back. When I was a child, kindergarten was optional. It was half a day, and you played. You sort of learned to get around with other children. You learned some colors, maybe your alphabet, but you weren't taught to read. These things happened, a year later. Now we're pushing back and back into preschool, emphasizing early learning, minimizing play. And this is a mismatch with how we evolved to learn. Don't get me wrong. I'm not advocating that we should all raise our children as if we're hunter-gatherers. Our culture demands some formal instruction. I think it does anyway. People like Peter Gray still would argue against that from an evolutionary perspective. But many of the things we try to teach young children are just not the way that we've evolved to learn them. Not that they can't learn them, but they are more apt to learn them through play, through discovery, and their brains will be more ready for more formal instruction a bit later on. You see this in exposure to screens. I won't say that 18-month-olds are on social media, but they watch a lot of videos, DVDs, television. There's what's called a video deficit. Rachel Barr has emphasized this a lot. So children who are taught things or read things or exposed to things on video versus face-to-face with real people, they can learn from them. They just don't learn from them quite as well. And there's some evidence that there's actually some interference going on, that early exposure can have some at least short-term negative consequences for subsequent learning. So no one's saying, well, I won't say no one. I'm not saying that you have to forbid young children in this digital age from ever being exposed to visual media until they're 2, 3, or 5 years of age. I know some parents who try to do this. It's tough. And children are growing up in a digital age. They need to be competent with digital media. But too much of it, particularly at the expense of more one-on-one, person-to-person interaction, can have some detrimental effects. Earlier is not always better.
Mm-hmm. So, and because you mentioned social media and other digital media, because now with this pandemic we are most of the time at home, do you think that it could be having any negative effects on children's development?
Oh yeah, it can. It can have negative. The pandemic is having negative effect on a lot of people's lives. It's highly variable, however. Across the globe, in weird societies, there are a lot of people who really weren't greatly affected. They still were able to go to work. Maybe they're working from home. They are in a household with several people, so they're not totally socially isolated. They have access to the internet and social media so they can stay in touch. And it's not the same, but it's not so terrible. There are other people who lose their jobs, lose their incomes because they are maybe living alone or with someone that they don't know all that well, or don't get along with quite well, or they have to expose themselves and have the stress of being exposed to people who may have COVID, and they're not doing as well. The incidence of alcoholism and opioid use in the U.S. has increased over the last year. These are not good signs. Same with children. Some children who are certainly going to be affected broadly. Part of it is the lack of interaction with other children. But some are going to be more affected than others. In terms of learning, those who have someone at home that can help them with their online learning, who have good internet connections, and are going to schools that have teachers who know how to use social media for teaching, their education is going to be not as adversely affected as children who don't have someone at home with them to help them keep them on task, who don't have reliable internet connection. Part of it is the haves and have-nots, as always. In terms of social interaction, I think it's tough for kids of all age. All kids need social interaction. Children are resilient, however, and especially if they can be online and Zooming with some friends every now and then. Maybe they get together with other kids who are in their bubble, which some kids have done safely, others not so safely. This can be a benefit. Other kids don't have this. Children who were high stress beforehand are probably going to be affected more adversely. So yes, this pandemic and the consequences of it are going to have negative effects on children, but it's going to be greater for some children than others. I don't think it's not going to be like children who experience a war and deprivation where everyone gets affected pretty harshly. Some are going to be affected more so than others.
Mm-hmm. So one last question. Since we're talking about mismatches, do you think we can learn anything from more traditional hunter-gatherer societies, which supposedly represent the ones or are closer to the ones we evolved in how to deal with these evolutionary mismatches? I mean, things that we can apply in our modern societies.
Oh, I think so. A number of theorists, Melvin Konner in particular, Peter Gray, among others, have proposed that hunter-gatherer societies and parenting in development should be the model. This is how children, our ancestors, developed. This should be what childhood was evolved to be, and we can use these insights to produce better, healthier environments for our children to grow up in. And so I think that's certainly true. We're not hunter-gatherer societies, however. So we have to keep in mind that in hunter-gatherer societies, children have very few options. Either you become a hunter-gatherer like your mother and father are, or you die. So there's a lot of motivation for kids to learn on their own. If that's not the case in modern culture. Modern culture, much learning is done out of context. You're taught to read, you're taught mathematics. Almost everything learning was done in context, through play, through observation, in hunter-gatherer cultures. Can we have more hands-on learning experiences that are consistent with hunter-gatherer childhoods? Maybe that'll be beneficial educationally. Yes, maybe so. But it doesn't mean that teaching is out the window, that we can just let kids educate themselves, so to speak. We have to at least provide the structure that education can occur in. And then different theorists and different contents can be instructed, discovered in different ways by children. Knowing the social nature of humans and how we develop friendships and learn to cooperate in ancient environments can be very useful in fostering social development and cooperation in contemporary development as well. Again, we've got to keep in mind we're not hunter-gatherers. But yes, I think in many ways, understanding our evolved tendencies, and they're tendencies, they're not absolute. We can learn to read and do calculus, which our ancestors had no notion of at all. We have the flexibility to do that. But we still have these evolved features of how we learn best at different ages. And so I think We can learn a lot from hunter-gatherers. Got to be careful. You expressed it quite accurately with hunter-gatherers, but sometimes people view just traditional environments with hunter-gatherer environments. Hunter-gatherer environments were very what David Lancy calls neotocracies. They emphasized children. They were very loving and very tolerant. In many traditional cultures, not hunter-gatherers, but horticulturists, fishing cultures, early agricultural societies, children were often treated quite harshly. And we don't want to emulate those. We, modern folk, are in many ways more like neotocracies. But we sometimes may overprotect our children, I suppose. And we need to give them the opportunities to, as in hunter-gatherer societies, explore, test the limits a little bit, usually through play, interaction, usually with older peers or younger peers, mixed age groups.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, okay, so the book is again How Children Invented Humanity, the Role of Development in Human Evolution. Just before we go, would you like to mention any other sources on the internet or elsewhere where people can find your work?
No, I really don't have much of a social media presence, I'm afraid. I don't tweet or blog. Maybe I should. Get with the 21st century, but maybe that's a little bit of the hunter-gatherer in me still. But thank you for the opportunity.
No, it's been my pleasure, and thank you for writing the book, by the way.
Well, it was my pleasure. Thank you for asking me to talk about it.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting it on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of the interview. The show is brought to you by people like you, so consider doing it. Otherwise, and if you like the interview, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Parerga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Pauline Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingart, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Yugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omer Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslo Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Ethan Solon, Roman Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Miran B, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Max Belby, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz. My producers is Arweba, Jim Frank, Lucas Staffini, Kian Gilligan, Sergio Godriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Nirvan Balachandran. And my executive producers, Michel Rzeski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.